in order to, like, just to kind of capitalize on what Betty Ray said a little bit, I'm going to actually talk a little bit more about bias and mental models, and particularly think about the human brain, right? So, and Betty Ray, like, kind of gave us a little, like, hashtag spoiler that this was coming, right? That we know that implicit bias is not is not coded for racist, right? And we know that, like, implicit bias is something that we can all have, and that's largely because of the way that our brains work and kind of the way that we move throughout society. So the thing that we need to think about relative to bias and mental models is, like, information processing. So the reality is, y'all, we are seeing so much information at once. Like, our brains can really only process a very small portion of what everything that we're taking in, even though most of us, like, have maybe not spent a lot of time out in society outside of in classroom, right? Like, because of the pandemic or whatever. It doesn't matter. Wherever you are, your brain is constantly processing so much information. And I want to say it's something a little bananas, like maybe 12 million bits of information, like, constantly. And so we can actually only be consciously aware of a very small portion of that information. And as a way to deal with that, essentially what happens is in our subconscious, our brain does three things. The first thing it does is it categorizes things. So guess what? Like, this is where and you look at somebody for the first time, you see somebody, and typically there's two ways people will categorize things very quickly according to the research: race, gender. So that's the first thing that our brains do. It automatically is going to categorize, because, again, we're trying to process so much information at once that part of the way that we can process this is that we can categorize into kind of likeness, because that makes it easier to process. The next thing that we do is we create associations, right? So if I say the words peanut butter, what is the first thing that pops into your head when I say peanut butter? Feel free to put that in the chat. What is it? Like, because I know what my answer is. P.S. Oh, this is great. Jelly, crunchy. Jelly, yum, sandwich, bread. Mine would have been bacon, by the way, peanut butter and bacon. I know it's delicious. But anyway, you see what I'm saying here? Like, we create associations, and we create associations based on, like, how we're moving through the world and, you know, what is all around us. That's the other thing that our brain does, is it fills in the gaps, right? So when we don't know information, we're going to categorize things, we're going to create associations. But how do we create associations when we don't know that information? We fill in the gaps in a way. And where do we fill in the gaps? Well, we fill in the gaps by the way that we're surrounded, right? Which means that we're going to fill in the gaps from the media, from social media these days, right? Like, I know a lot of people get their information from Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, or, you know, fill in the blank there, right? But we're gonna literally fill in the gaps of what we don't know based on all of the things that are surrounding us and the way that we take in information, right? So if we're thinking about environments in where we're only seeing a lot of ourselves reflected, right? That's how we start to create that vision, right? That's how we fill in the gaps and we create that vision of the world. So these things all essentially start to contribute to and make up our mental models. And our mental models are essentially the frames that help us better understand and navigate the world. These are going to be influenced by the way that you were raised, by your race, by your socioeconomic status, by the media that you're consuming, right? Like, so that's why we talk about racism and anti-racism. And, like, understanding that, you know, like, there's not a I'm not racist, there's anti-racist and there's racist, because all of those things essentially are contributing to the mental models. Like, as we're taking that information in, it contributes to those mental models and how we move through the world. So if we understand that our brains are designed in such a way that they're going to create shortcuts in order for us to, you know, process all of this information, and we couple that with the idea that we know that those shortcuts are often influenced by the things that we are exposed to, that gives us the basis to start doing some of that critical reflection. Next slide. So if we think about those mental models, right, they're going to shape what we think and how we understand. If they're shaping how we think or if they're shaping what we think and how we understand, that means they're also going to impact how we see our connections and opportunities. And they essentially simplify complexity, right? So we talked about the fact that your brain is trying to process all of this information at once. So in order to simplify it, it categorizes it, it creates associations, and it fills in the gaps. All of those things therefore impact your reasoning and how we assign relevance of pieces, right? So as we think about the fact that we are all professionals, you all are professionals as educators, you're in your classrooms, now knowing this, that means that one of the things that we have to do is we have to continuously engage in that critical reflection. Next slide. So I'm going to kick off a little bit about critical reflection, and then I'm going to hand it over to Raquam in just a minute. But essentially, when we think about critical reflection and we think about what we just talked about relative to how our brains work and how they're influenced by all of those things around us, that means we need to critically reflect on what our perceptions are. So how we see people and how we perceive reality, we need to do some critical reflection around that. Don't worry, Raquam's going to tell you how to engage in that critical reflection. I'm just telling you that we need to do it, right? We need to critically reflect on our attitude. How do we react towards certain people, and sit with that. We need to reflect on our behaviors, like how receptive are we towards certain people, or how not receptive are we? We need to reflect on where our attention goes. So which aspects of a person do we pay the most attention to? And we need to reflect on our listening. How much do we actively listen to what certain people say? Now, I will tell you personally, that's one I have to do a lot of hard work on for a lot of different reasons. And, one of the biggest things that I know is as soon as people start spouting off well, research, blah, 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 or the regulations, and then says a number, I think I pretty much just go dead inside and I stop listening, right? So that's something where I have to critically reflect on why that's happening. And that's just a really benign example of the fact that the first thing we have to do is recognize that we need to do these things and then engage in that reflection. And then the last thing that we really want to reflect on are micro affirmations. And you might say, well, DJ, what are micro affirmations? I know what microaggressions are, but what's a micro affirmation? Well, at the other end of the scale there, a micro affirmation is how much comfort we give to people. How much are we reinforcing positively, and how much comfort or how little comfort are we giving to people? And then looking at, critically reflecting on what that pattern looks like. Am I only giving comfort to people that look a certain way or that behave a certain way? And am I giving less comfort to people that behave a certain way or look a certain way? So those are the types of critical reflections that we want to start to look at so that we can acknowledge them, we can address them, and we can adapt. So Raquam, you want to take over from here?
Thanks, DJ. Critical reflection supports efforts at challenging teachers' assumptions about student learning and their capabilities. The same can be said about teachers' assumptions of the families they engage with as well. The goal, or the actual ultimate goal of critical reflection, is praxis. Praxis is the combination of reflection and action aimed at transforming the world. So praxis is really a continuous cycle of applying theory into action and then reflecting on it. So it's really not enough for people to come together and dialogue to gain knowledge on their social reality. Saying that I hold close to myself is life is not just about the introductory handshake. The follow-up can prove to be the most important at times. So let's openly digest the concept of critical reflection on praxis so that we can learn how to take action against our assumptions. Next slide, please. For educators, critical reflection on praxis can be done within the context of your teaching practices. So engaging in cycles of critical reflection on praxis equip teachers with the skills to examine their social realities, examine student outcomes, engage in perspective taking, enact problem solving, interrogate their personal assumptions, examine marginalization issues, and deconstructing existing social order. The opportunity and ability to develop and exercise these skills are critical to supporting culturally appropriate practices. Critical reflection on praxis can support in combating the lack of understanding by educators regarding the essential cultural differences and their limited or no engagement with value systems of support operating within the communities different than those they have traditionally experienced or have traditionally worked with or even had the opportunity to learn. Strategy on practice involves identifying the problem within the context of the targeted students. So we want to keep in mind that this is not a one size fits all situation. We should come into each to the identifying the problem phase with an open mind. Also, analyzing the problem through a culturally appropriate lens. And this is going to take a lot of time and practice as we have new perspectives to consider, and we're trying to work on incorporating these into our current worldly view. Also, creating a plan of action to address the problem. So the action part is very key. We can come together, we can talk, we can discuss, we can exchange knowledge, but this without action really is not enough to tackle this problem. So this is both an individual and a collective effort that takes a level of commitment from all participants. The actual implementation of the plan, that's a part of a practice strategy. So once again, this is very important, and analysis and evaluation of the action. So that reflection part is very important as well, as you can do this individually, but it's also a collective effort. Next slide, please. So Paulo Freire says that true knowledge emerges only through restlessness, impatient, continuing, hopeful, critical inquiry with other people about their relations to the world. So this is a collective process, and it will involve us to interact, listen, and engage with others whom have varying perspectives and experiences. He also spoke on a few concepts that support critical reflection on praxis, such as dialogue. So during dialogue, individuals must trust the others to maintain a mutual respect and commitment. Each individual must question what they know and realize that through dialogue, existing thoughts will change and new knowledge will be created. So we have to be very open when we're engaging in dialogue with others. Also, Paulo Freire speaks on the Easter experience, and this is really speaking on the commitment that it takes in order for us to continuously go through the cycle of praxis, right? So those who authentically commit themselves to the people or commit themselves to equity, diversity, inclusion efforts, they must re-examine themselves constantly. This is not a one-type situation. This is something that you do continuously, and it takes practice and a lot of patience with yourself as well. Those who undergo it can no longer remain as they were. So if you successfully are reflecting and going through critical reflection on your praxis, you should come back with different thoughts, a different perspective, or at least a different view on what you actually were reflecting on. Lastly, they do not mix feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone, right? So we have to get outside of ourselves. There's no space for ambivalent behavior. The last concept that Paulo Freire speaks on is conscientization, or the process of developing a critical awareness of one's social reality through reflection and action. As we know, that's a part and a piece of praxis. Since we all acquire social myths of the dominant tendency, conscientization contributes to the liberation from us liberating ourselves from our own assumptions. Those assumptions that may hinder educators' ability or capacity to implement culturally appropriate practices, which are proven by research to increase positive student outcomes, not just for marginalized populations, but for all students. So let's keep these concepts in mind as we move towards our final activity of this seminar. Next slide, please.